The rain lashed against the windows as Isabella woke abruptly, gasping for air. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her palms were clammy with sweat. The nightmare had returned, the dark basement, Lucas's cold eyes, and the blood that seemed to seep endlessly. But this time, the nightmare was a memory. She sat up, clutching her knees to her chest. The dim light of dawn filtered through the curtains, painting her room in hues of gray. She had been given a second chance, a chance to escape the tragedy that had consumed her life. But the weight of her past, of love betrayed and pain endured, hung over her like a specter. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her out of her thoughts. The name on the screen made her stomach twist, Lucas. Against her better judgment, she answered. Isabella, Lucas's voice came through, sharp and distant. Juliet's going through a rough time. I'm hosting a singles party for her tonight. Don't come. She doesn't need unnecessary distractions. Unnecessary distractions. The word sliced through her like a knife. She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, the metallic taste grounding her. I understand, she replied, her voice steady, despite the storm raging within her. I won't disturb you. In fact, I have business in France. I'll be leaving tonight. Lucas paused, caught off guard by her calm response. That's sensible, he said, his tone softening slightly. As the call ended, Isabella stared at the phone in her hand. The pain she had carried for 2 lifetimes surged to the surface. Lucas's indifference, Juliet's manipulations, and her own blind devotion, she had been a pawn in their cruel game. But not this time. She turned to her desk and began packing. Her hands moved with purpose, though tears blurred her vision. A plane ticket to France sat neatly beside her laptop. Leaving wasn't just a means to escape, it was her first step toward reclaiming her life. Her best friend, Lily, arrived later that morning, concern etched into her features. Are you sure about this? She asked, watching Isabella pack. It feels so sudden. I need this, Lily, Isabella replied, her voice firm. I can't keep drowning in the past. I need to breathe, to live. Lily hugged her tightly, her warmth momentarily easing the ache in Isabella's heart. Then go. Find yourself. Find your happiness. By the time Isabella boarded the plane that evening, the city that had been both her home and her prison grew smaller beneath her. She exhaled deeply, letting the gravity of her decision sink in. She was leaving behind Lucas, Juliet, and everything that had once defined her existence. For the first time in her life, or rather, lives, she felt free. As the plane soared into the night, Isabella looked out at the endless expanse of stars. Somewhere in France, her destiny awaited. And she was ready to meet it. The soft glow of the Eiffel Tower greeted Isabella as her plane landed in Paris. The city was alive with light and motion, but a profound quiet settled in her chest. She had made it. She was far from Lucas, far from Juliet, and far from the suffocating pain of her past. Her first steps in France felt surreal. The crisp air carried the scent of baked bread and coffee, mingling with the murmur of French conversations. Everything here felt new, untouched by the ghosts of her old life. She clutched her suitcase tightly, her resolve strengthening with each step toward the taxi stand. The drive to her new apartment was a blur of narrow streets, historic architecture, and bustling cafes. The space she had rented was modest but cozy, nestled on the top floor of a centuries-old building with a view of a quaint courtyard. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of excitement, a sense of possibility. She spent her first few days settling in, exploring the neighborhood, and familiarizing herself with her surroundings. Her mornings began with croissants and coffee at a nearby cafe, where the elderly owner greeted her warmly, despite her hesitant French. Evenings were quieter, spent unpacking and reflecting on the weight of her decisions. But one evening, as she sat by the window with a book, a knock on the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she opened it to find a man standing there, his hands tucked into the pockets of a well-tailored coat. Bonsoir, he greeted, his voice deep and smooth. His dark hair was tousled by the evening breeze, and his piercing blue eyes met hers with a curious intensity. "Are you Isabella?" "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you are?" "Edward," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Your father's friend's son. My father mentioned you'd be here. I thought I'd stop by to see if you needed anything." Her father's friend's son? The name tugged at a memory she hadn't revisited in years. Edward had been a constant nuisance in her childhood, a mischievous boy who loved to tease her endlessly. But the man before her now bore little resemblance to the boy she remembered. He exuded confidence and charm, his demeanor as polished as his appearance. "Oh," she said, momentarily at a loss for words. "I didn't expect anyone." "I can see that," he teased gently, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Don't worry, I'm not here to intrude. Just thought you might appreciate some company in a new city." She hesitated, but something about his presence felt disarming. "Would you like to come in?" Edward stepped inside, glancing around the small apartment. "Nice place. Quaint. Very, you." Isabella rolled her eyes, a flicker of amusement breaking through her guarded demeanor. "And how would you know what's me?" "I remember more than you think," he said lightly, settling onto the edge of the couch. "You used to chase me around with a stick when I annoyed you. I'd say this apartment has the same kind of charm." "Charming," she replied dryly, unable to suppress a small smile. Their conversation flowed easily, much to her surprise. Edward spoke about his travels, his work in architecture, and his decision to return to Europe after years abroad. Isabella found herself laughing at his witty remarks, her wariness slowly melting away. As the evening wore on, Edward leaned back, his expression turning serious. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he asked softly. She stiffened, the wall she had let down momentarily rising again. "Why would you say that?" "You have this look," he said, his gaze searching hers. "Like someone carrying more than they should." Isabella looked away, her fingers curling around the edge of her cup. "We all have our burdens," she said quietly. Edward didn't press further, sensing her reluctance. Instead, he changed the subject, lightening the mood with a story about getting lost in a remote French village. By the time he left, Isabella felt a strange sense of comfort, like a seed of hope had been planted in her chest. The days turned into weeks, and Isabella found herself gradually settling into her new life. She started a job teaching music at a local school, a role that brought her unexpected joy. Her students' bright faces and enthusiasm for learning gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Edward became a regular presence in her life, often stopping by unannounced with pastries or flowers. His easy charm and warm humor became a balm for her wounded heart, though she remained cautious about letting him too close. She had learned the hard way that love could be a double-edged sword. One afternoon, as they strolled along the Seine, Edward turned to her with a smile. "I have to say, Paris suits you." "Does it?" she asked, glancing at him. "Yes," he said, his expression softening. "You seem lighter here, freer. Like you're finally becoming the person you were meant to be." His words struck a chord deep within her. For so long, she had been defined by her love for Lucas and the pain it had brought her. But now, standing in the city of light, she was beginning to find herself again. "Maybe," she said softly, a small smile gracing her lips. "Maybe I am." The months passed like a gentle dream, and Isabella's life in Paris began to feel like her own. She filled her days with music, her nights with quiet reflection, and her weekends exploring the city's secrets. Edward was a constant companion, his presence an unexpected comfort she had grown to treasure. Yet, despite the tranquility, the shadows of her past clung to her, waiting for a moment to strike. One late autumn evening, Isabella found herself sitting in a cozy café near Montmartre. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and roasting chestnuts. She was lost in a book, the world around her fading into the background, when the café door swung open. A gust of wind swept in, carrying with it a voice she hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. "Isabella?" her heart stopped. She froze, her fingers tightening around the pages of her book as she slowly looked up. There, standing in the doorway, was Lucas. The sight of him hit her like a punch to the gut. He looked the same, tall, composed, his sharp features as striking as ever. But there was something different about him, something heavier. His eyes, once filled with cold indifference, now brimmed with desperation. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been looking for you." The words sent a chill down her spine. She closed her book with deliberate calm and set it aside. "You found me. Now what?" He sat across from her, his movements tentative, almost hesitant. I just wanted to see you. To talk." "Talk?" She couldn't keep the bitterness from creeping into her tone. "I didn't think we had anything left to say to each other." Lucas winced, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I know I hurt you, Isabella. I know I made mistakes. But I didn't realize how much he paused, searching for the right words. How much I needed you until you were gone." She stared at him, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You needed me?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Lucas, you didn't just hurt me. You destroyed me. Do you even know what you did to my life? To my soul?" "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But after you left, everything fell apart. Juliet, she lied to me. She used me. And when I realized what I had lost, it was too late." Isabella laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "It's always about Juliet, isn't it? Even now, you're here because of her." "No," Lucas said quickly, his eyes pleading. "I'm here because of you. I was a fool, Isabella. I let her manipulate me, but it was you I loved. It's always been you." The words she had once longed to hear fell flat now, their weight lost in the ashes of her past. She shook her head, her voice steadier than she felt. "You don't love me, Lucas. You never did. You only loved the idea of having me by your side while you played hero to Juliet." Lucas reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her movements swift and firm. "Please, Isabella," he whispered. "Give me a chance to make things right." "There's nothing left to fix," she replied, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound echoing in the quiet cafe. "You and we're over. We've been over for a long time." She grabbed her coat and walked toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stepped into the cold night, Lucas's voice called after her. "Isabella, wait." She didn't stop. She couldn't. The pain, the anger, and the memories were too much. She needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of his presence. That night, as she sat in her apartment staring at the city lights, Edward's knock came as a welcome interruption. He entered with his usual smile, a bottle of wine in hand, but his expression shifted the moment he saw her face. "Isabella, what happened?" She hesitated, unsure if she could voice the storm swirling inside her. But Edward's concerned gaze broke through her defenses, and she found herself telling him everything: Lucas, Juliet, the heartbreak, and the encounter at the cafe. When she finished, Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't owe him anything, Isabella. Not your forgiveness, not your time, and certainly not your pain." His words wrapped around her like a shield, reinforcing the walls she had begun to rebuild. "I know," she said softly. But seeing him again, it stirred everything up. It's like the wounds were ripped open all over again. Edward reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "You've come so far, Isabella. Don't let him drag you back." She met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes, calming the turmoil inside her. "I won't," she promised, her voice resolute. But as the days passed, Lucas's reappearance lingered in her mind. The shadows of her past, which she had worked so hard to escape, now loomed larger than ever. And as much as she wanted to leave them behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that her battle with Lucas, and with herself, was far from over. Isabella tried to move forward, but Lucas's sudden reappearance hung in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Each step she took in her new life felt tainted by memories of him, and her resolve to keep him out began to waver under the weight of the past. The day after their encounter, she sat at her desk, flipping through the notes for her next music class. She stared blankly at the pages, her thoughts drifting. Why now? Why Paris? And why, after everything, did Lucas still have the power to unsettle her? The questions followed her relentlessly, gnawing at the edges of her newfound peace. That evening, she decided to confront them head-on. She pulled out her phone, hesitating briefly, before scrolling to Lucas's number. Taking a deep breath, she typed a message, "Meet me at Café Rousseau tomorrow, at 5 p.m. This ends now." The next day, Isabella arrived at the cafe early, choosing a quiet table in the back. She sipped her tea, her stomach churning as she watched the minutes tick by. At exactly 5, Lucas walked in. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her almost instantly. He approached hesitantly, his usual confidence tempered by uncertainty. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he sat across from her. "This isn't a social call," Isabella replied coolly. "I need answers, Lucas. Why are you here? Why now?" Lucas leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I told you, I realized what I'd lost." "No," she said firmly, cutting him off. "That's not what I'm asking. You showing up in Paris after all this time isn't a coincidence. What do you want from me?" For a moment, Lucas seemed at a loss for words. Then he sighed, his expression darkening. "Juliet left me." Isabella's stomach twisted, but she kept her face impassive. "And you thought I'd, what? Take you back? Console you?" "No," he said quickly. "It's not like that. I've been trying to fix things, Isabella. With you, with my life. But everything fell apart after you left. Juliet wasn't who I thought she was. She only cared about my name, my position. When she realized I didn't have the power or wealth she expected, she moved on." "Good for her," Isabella said flatly. "And you? Are you expecting pity?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "I'm not here for pity. I'm here because I made a mistake, 1,000 mistakes. I thought if I could find you, if I could show you how much I've changed." "Stop," Isabella interrupted. "You don't get to rewrite history, Lucas. You don't get to show up here and pretend everything can be undone with an apology." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Lucas stared at her, a flicker of desperation in his eyes. "I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know I'm sorry. For everything." Isabella studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity in his expression. And while part of her wanted to believe him, the wounds he had inflicted ran too deep. "I accept your apology," she said at last, her voice calm but detached. "But it doesn't change anything. I've moved on, Lucas. And so should you." He nodded slowly, though the defeat in his posture was evident. "Is there someone else?" he asked hesitantly. Isabella hesitated, thinking of Edward. They weren't in a relationship, at least not officially, but his presence in her life had been a source of strength and comfort. "Yes," she said finally. "There is." Lucas's face fell, but he didn't argue. "I see," he murmured. "Then I wish you happiness, Isabella. Truly." He stood to leave, but before he turned away, he added, "I'll go. But if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." That night, Isabella replayed their conversation in her mind, feeling an odd mixture of relief and unease. She had told Lucas the truth, she had moved on, but his presence had stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. Edward stopped by later that evening, his usual light-heartedness quickly giving way to concern when he saw her pensive expression. "What happened?" he asked. She hesitated, then told him about her meeting with Lucas. Edward listened quietly, his gaze steady as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't owe him anything," he said. "Whatever guilt or regret he's carrying, that's his burden, not yours." "I know," Isabella said, her voice wavering. "But part of me feels unsettled. Like there's something he's not telling me." Edward frowned. "Do you think he's hiding something?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over." Edward reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "If he's hiding something, you'll figure it out. And whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." His words brought her a measure of comfort, but as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the unease remained. Lucas's return had brought more than memories, it had brought questions. And Isabella couldn't rest until she found the answers. Isabella couldn't shake the sense that Lucas's reappearance carried more weight than he had let on. The way he had spoken at the cafe, his eyes filled with desperation, hinted at something deeper, something hidden. She tried to push it aside, to immerse herself in her new life, but the nagging feeling lingered. One afternoon, as she prepared for her music class, her phone buzzed with a message. The name on the screen made her heart skip a beat. "Lucas. I need to talk to you. Please." She stared at the message, her instincts telling her to ignore it. But a tiny voice in the back of her mind urged her to respond. Against her better judgment, she typed a reply, "One last time. Meet me at Jardin des Tuileries tomorrow at 3 p.m. The next day, the park was alive with the sounds of children laughing and the rustling of leaves in the crisp autumn breeze. Isabella arrived early, choosing a bench near the fountains. She didn't have to wait long. Lucas appeared, his posture tense as he approached her. "You're here," he said, relief washing over his face. "Get to the point," Isabella replied, her tone sharp. "You said you needed to talk. So talk." Lucas sat beside her, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I didn't tell you everything before. About Juliet. About why I'm here." She crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "Then start now." He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Juliet's gone." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Isabella's brow furrowed. "Gone? What do you mean?" "She disappeared," Lucas explained, his voice low. "A few months ago, she just vanished. No warning, no note, nothing. The authorities haven't been able to find her." Isabella studied him, searching for any sign of deception. "And what does this have to do with me?" "I think," he stopped, taking a deep breath. "I think she might have been involved in something dangerous. Before she left, she was acting strange, paranoid. She kept saying someone was after her." Isabella's heart began to race. "And you came to me because—" "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Maybe I thought you'd understand. Maybe I thought I could protect you." "Protect me?" She scoffed, her voice laced with disbelief. "From what, Lucas? Juliet's choices aren't my concern. They're not yours either, not anymore." Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her uneasy. "You don't get it, Isabella. I think they're watching me now. And if they know about us, about you, there is no us," she interjected, standing abruptly. "There hasn't been for a long time. Isabella, please." Lucas grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Just, be careful. That's all I'm asking." She pulled her arm free, her voice cold. "I don't need your warnings, Lucas. Whatever mess you or Juliet are involved in, leave me out of it." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding. His words played over and over in her mind. Was it paranoia? Or was there something more to Juliet's disappearance? That evening, Edward stopped by her apartment with takeout, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. As they ate, Isabella recounted her conversation with Lucas, her unease spilling out in a torrent of words. Edward frowned, setting down his fork. You think he's telling the truth? I don't know, Isabella admitted. But something about it felt real. Like he's genuinely scared. Edward leaned back, his expression thoughtful. If Juliet's disappearance is as serious as he says, there might be something to it. But that doesn't mean you need to get involved. I'm not planning to, she said quickly. But I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just about her. It feels bigger. Edward reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Whatever it is, you're not facing it alone. His words were comforting, but they did little to quell the growing sense of dread inside her. Over the next few days, Isabella tried to put the encounter with Lucas out of her mind, but the tension only grew. Strange things began to happen, small, subtle things that were easy to dismiss at first. She noticed a figure lingering near her apartment building one evening, their face obscured by a hood. Another time, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched as she walked home from work. By the time she found a plain envelope slipped under her door, her unease had turned to fear. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words scrawled in bold, black ink, "Stay out." Her hands trembled as she held the note. She knew then that Lucas's warnings weren't unfounded. Whatever had happened to Juliet, it was creeping into her life now, and ignoring it was no longer an option. That night, she called Edward, her voice shaky as she recounted the events. He arrived at her apartment within minutes, his protective instincts kicking in immediately. "We're going to figure this out," he said firmly. "Whatever's going on, we'll get to the bottom of it." Isabella nodded, clutching the note tightly. "I just want it to end." Edward's expression hardened. "It will. But first, we need to find out who's behind this, and why they're targeting you." The warning note felt like a ticking time bomb in Isabella's hands. Its vague but ominous message echoed in her mind, fueling her unease. For the first time since arriving in Paris, her haven felt compromised, and her newfound peace seemed fragile. Edward stayed the night, sleeping on the couch in her small apartment. His presence was comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this unsettling new chapter. But as Isabella lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, questions churned in her mind. Why was she being targeted? What connection did Juliet's disappearance have to her? And who would go to such lengths to intimidate her? By morning, Isabella was determined to find answers. Edward wasn't thrilled with her decision to dig deeper. "We should let the police handle this," he insisted as they sipped coffee in her kitchen. "And tell them what?" Isabella countered. "That someone left a creepy note under my door? They'll dismiss it as a prank. No, if I want to figure this out, I have to do it myself." Edward frowned but didn't argue further. Instead, he said, "If you're going to do this, you're not doing it alone." She nodded, grateful for his support. Together, they devised a plan to gather more information, starting with the most obvious lead, Lucas. Later that day, Isabella called Lucas, arranging to meet him in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. She brought Edward with her, his presence both a source of strength and a silent reminder that she wouldn't be manipulated again. When Lucas arrived, his eyes flicked to Edward, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "Who's this?" he asked. "A friend," Isabella said flatly. "You have a problem with that?" Lucas shook his head, sinking into the chair across from them. "No. Let's just get to the point." "Good idea," Isabella said, leaning forward. "What aren't you telling me, Lucas? Who's watching you? And why am I involved?" Lucas hesitated, glancing nervously around the cafe before lowering his voice. "Juliet was mixed up with some dangerous people. I don't know the details, but it was bad. She owed them money, more than I could ever pay back. When she disappeared, they came after me, thinking I had something to do with it." "And why would they think I'm involved?" Isabella asked, her tone sharp. Lucas looked genuinely pained. "Because of us. Because they know about our history. They think you might know something." "About Juliet?" Isabella asked, incredulous. "That's ridiculous. I haven't seen her in years." They don't care, Lucas said grimly. They'll use anyone connected to her, or me, to get what they want. Who are they? Edward interjected, his voice steady but cold. Lucas's jaw tightened. I don't know their names. They're careful, hidden. But they're powerful, and they don't play games. Isabella exchanged a glance with Edward. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. That night, back in her apartment, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something much larger than herself. The note under her door, the lingering figure outside her building, the growing sense of unease, they were all connected. And if Lucas was telling the truth, she was a pawn in a dangerous game she didn't understand. Edward stayed late, poring over everything they knew. If these people are as dangerous as Lucas says, we need to figure out who they are, and fast. How? Isabella asked, frustration creeping into her voice. It's not like we have a list of suspects. Edward tapped his fingers on the table, his expression thoughtful. Maybe we start with Juliet. If she's at the center of this, then finding out what she was involved in might give us some answers. Isabella nodded slowly. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Where do we begin? Edward smiled faintly. You'd be surprised what you can find when you know where to look. The next day, Edward worked his connections to dig into Juliet's life, tracing her movements and financial transactions in the months leading up to her disappearance. Isabella helped where she could, though her nerves made it hard to focus. By the end of the day, they had uncovered a trail of breadcrumbs that painted a troubling picture. Juliet had been withdrawing large sums of money from her accounts, often in cash, and transferring smaller amounts to offshore accounts under various aliases. The pattern suggested someone either fleeing or preparing for a dangerous confrontation. But the most chilling discovery came from Edward's contact at a local bank. Juliet's last withdrawal had been just days before she vanished, and the transaction had been flagged for suspicious activity. A note in the file mentioned a heated argument with a man described as tall, dark-haired, with piercing blue eyes. Isabella's blood ran cold. The description matched Lucas. Confronting Lucas again wasn't an option, at least not yet. Instead, Isabella and Edward decided to focus on the next lead, the note under her door. Edward suggested installing a hidden camera near her apartment's entrance, hoping to catch whoever was watching her. The waiting game was nerve-wracking, but Isabella knew it was necessary. Every step brought them closer to the truth, and closer to danger. Days passed without incident, but then, late one night, the camera captured movement. A hooded figure approached her door, glancing nervously over their shoulder, before slipping another envelope under it. Edward retrieved it carefully, opening it with gloved hands. Inside was a single photograph of Isabella, taken from a distance as she walked home. Scrawled across the back were the words, "Leave Paris or you'll regret it." Isabella's hand shook as she stared at the photo. The message was clear, whoever was behind this wasn't done with her yet. And she was running out of time. The photograph was a tangible reminder that Isabella was being watched, her every move scrutinized by an unseen force. Fear tightened its grip on her chest as she sat across from Edward in her small apartment, the photo and its menacing words laid out on the table between them. "They're escalating," Edward said, his voice heavy with concern. "Whoever this is, they're not going to stop." "We can't ignore this anymore," Isabella replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to figure out who's behind this, before they make good on their threats." Edward nodded. "Agreed. But we have to be smart about it. They've already shown they're willing to intimidate you. We can't underestimate what they might do next." Isabella clenched her hands into fists, her resolve hardening. "Then let's start by finding out who they are." Edward had a plan. Using the footage from the hidden camera, he intended to enhance the image of the hooded figure and trace their movements. He had a contact, a private investigator, who specialized in cases like this. Within hours, the investigator had analyzed the footage and provided a potential lead. The figure had been spotted heading into a nearby alley after delivering the note. That alley is connected to a network of backstreets, the investigator explained. It's commonly used as a shortcut to avoid main roads. There's a good chance your person is local. Edward and Isabella decided to follow the lead. The next day, they walked the streets near her apartment, their eyes scanning for anything unusual. The city's usual vibrancy felt muted, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on them. Their search eventually led them to a small, nondescript cafe tucked into a side street. It was the kind of place easily overlooked, its faded sign and dim interior blending into the background of the bustling city. But something about it caught Edward's attention. That's the same cafe where Lucas said he met someone before Juliet disappeared, he said quietly, nodding toward the building. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. You think it's connected? Edward shrugged. It's worth checking out. Inside, the cafe was sparsely populated, its patrons hunched over steaming cups and quiet conversations. Edward and Isabella took a table near the back, their eyes sweeping the room. It wasn't long before a man entered, his hood pulled low over his face. That's him, Edward murmured, his voice low. The guy from the video. Isabella's pulse quickened as she watched the man order a coffee and take a seat by the window. He didn't look in their direction, but his body language was tense, as though he were waiting for someone. What do we do? Isabella whispered. We watch, Edward replied. And if he leaves, we follow. The man sat at the cafe for nearly an hour, his gaze darting to the door every few minutes. Finally, a second figure arrived, a woman dressed in a sleek black coat, her hair tucked under a scarf. The two exchanged brief words before slipping out the door together. Edward and Isabella followed at a safe distance, their footsteps muffled by the noise of the city. The pair led them through a maze of narrow streets, finally stopping at an unmarked door in an old brick building. The woman knocked twice, and the door opened just enough for them to slip inside. What now? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Edward's jaw tightened. We wait. And we find out what's going on in there. The hours dragged by as they watched the building from a nearby alley. Just as Edward was considering calling the investigator for backup, the door opened, and the hooded man stepped out alone. He lit a cigarette, his eyes scanning the street before he began walking away. Edward gestured for Isabella to stay put. I'll follow him. You stay here and keep an eye on the building. Be careful, she whispered, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Edward nodded and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Isabella alone in the dimly lit alley. She leaned against the wall, her senses on high alert. The building loomed before her, its windows dark and uninviting. Minutes felt like hours, and her nerves frayed with every passing second. Just as she was considering retreating, the door opened again, and the woman emerged. She was alone this time, her posture stiff as she walked briskly down the street. Isabella hesitated. Following her could be dangerous, but this might be her only chance to learn more. Steeling herself, she stepped out of the shadows and trailed the woman at a careful distance. The woman's path took her to a quiet residential area, where she entered a building through a side entrance. Isabella waited outside, her heart racing. She debated her next move when the woman's voice startled her. Can I help you? Isabella whirled around to find the woman standing in the doorway, her eyes sharp and calculating. Her instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm lost, Isabella stammered, gesturing vaguely to the street. I was trying to find my way back to the main road. The woman's gaze lingered on her, suspicion flickering in her eyes. This isn't a good neighborhood to wander around in, she said coolly. You should leave. Isabella nodded quickly, mumbling a thanks, before hurrying away. She didn't stop until she was far from the building, her breath coming in short gasps. Whoever that woman was, she wasn't just a bystander. And Isabella had a sinking feeling that she was in far deeper than she had imagined. When she reunited with Edward later that night, she recounted her encounter, her voice shaky. He listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. We're getting closer, he said. but this is bigger than we thought. We need to be careful. Isabella nodded, her resolve unshaken despite her fear. Whatever web she had stumbled into, she was determined to untangle it, before it consumed her entirely. The encounter with the woman left Isabella more determined but also more aware of the danger she faced. She and Edward spent the next day piecing together what they had learned. The mysterious woman, the hooded figure, and the ominous note all pointed to one conclusion: whoever these people were, they were deeply connected to Juliet's disappearance. Edward contacted his investigator again, sharing the details of the building where they had followed the pair. The investigator promised to dig into property records and surveillance footage from the area, but it would take time. Meanwhile, Isabella wrestled with her growing unease. A few days later, the investigator called with new information. The building is owned by a shell company, he explained. But I traced it back to a larger network of accounts. It looks like it's tied to a money laundering operation. There's also some chatter about ties to illegal gambling and loan sharking. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. And Juliet? I couldn't find any direct evidence linking her to the building, the investigator said. But given her financial activity before she disappeared, it's not hard to connect the dots. If she was involved with these people, it could explain why she went off the grid. Edward's voice was grim. And why they're targeting Isabella? The investigator hesitated. There's more. The woman you described. She's been seen meeting with a man who matches Lucas's description. I don't know what their connection is, but it's something to consider. Isabella's grip tightened on the phone. Lucas? Are you saying he's part of this? Not necessarily, the investigator replied. But he's involved in some way. Whether he knows it or not, he's linked to these people. The revelation sent Isabella's thoughts spiraling. Lucas had claimed he was a victim, dragged into Juliet's mess. But what if he wasn't as innocent as he pretended? That evening, Edward and Isabella decided it was time to confront Lucas again. They arranged to meet him at a secluded park, away from prying eyes. Lucas arrived late, his disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the confident man Isabella had once known. Why did you call me? He asked, his voice weary. We need answers, Isabella said, her tone steely. And this time, we want the truth. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've already told you everything I know. Really? Edward interjected, his voice cold. Because we've been looking into the people you're supposedly running from. And your name keeps coming up. Lucas's eyes darted between them, a flicker of panic crossing his face. What are you talking about? The woman we saw you with, Isabella said, watching his reaction closely. The one connected to Juliet. Who is she, Lucas? And what are you hiding? Lucas's expression hardened. You've been spying on me? We're trying to protect ourselves, Edward snapped. And from where we're standing, you're not exactly trustworthy. For a moment, Lucas looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged. Fine, he said quietly. You want the truth? Here it is, I owed them money. A lot of it. What? Isabella asked, her stomach twisting. Juliet got me into it, Lucas admitted, his voice heavy with shame. She convinced me to invest in some scheme, something about doubling our money through offshore accounts. It sounded too good to be true, and it was. By the time I realized what was happening, the money was gone, and I was in debt. And the woman? Edward pressed. What's her role in all this? She's their enforcer, Lucas said reluctantly. She handles the debts, makes sure people pay. I met with her to try to negotiate, to buy myself more time. Isabella stared at him, anger and disbelief boiling inside her. And you didn't think to tell me this before? I didn't want to drag you into it, Lucas said, his voice rising. I thought if I could handle it myself, they'd leave you alone. Well, they haven't, Edward said sharply. They left a note under her door. They're watching her, Lucas. Whatever you thought you were protecting her from, you failed. Lucas paled. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know they were going after her. You need to fix this, Isabella said, her voice trembling with anger. Whatever deal you made with them, whatever mess you're in, fix it. I'm not going to be collateral damage in your disaster. I'll try, Lucas said, his tone desperate. I'll talk to them, explain, save it, Edward cut him off. We're done here. As they walked away, Isabella felt a mix of relief and fury. Lucas's cowardice and lies had brought this chaos into her life, but at least now she understood the stakes. Whoever these people were, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And if Lucas couldn't protect her, she would have to protect herself. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. The weight of everything pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. She stood by the window, staring out at the Paris skyline, her mind racing. Edward approached silently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this, he said softly. Together. Isabella turned to him, her eyes filled with determination. I'm done running, Edward. If they want to intimidate me, fine. But I'm not going to let them control my life. Edward nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Then we fight back. The decision to fight back gave Isabella a renewed sense of purpose, but it also meant stepping deeper into a world she barely understood. Edward worked tirelessly to fortify her safety, installing security cameras, changing the locks, and even arranging a burner phone for emergencies. But these precautions were just the beginning. Edward's investigator came through with another lead. The woman they had followed was named Adrienne Laurent, a known enforcer for an underground criminal syndicate operating in Paris. Adrienne's reputation for ruthlessness was well documented, and her connection to Juliet's disappearance became increasingly clear. We need to find out more about Adrienne, Edward said as they pored over the information in Isabella's apartment. If she's the key to this, we need to understand her role. And what about Lucas? Isabella asked, her voice tight. If he's still meeting with her, he could be putting all of us in danger. Edward hesitated, then said, we'll keep an eye on him, but for now, Adrienne is our priority. That evening, Isabella and Edward staked out the cafe where Adrienne had been spotted. Hours passed with no sign of her, but their patience was rewarded when she finally arrived, slipping inside with a man who looked equally out of place. They exchanged brief words at the counter before disappearing into a back room. I'll follow, Edward whispered. Stay here and keep watch. No, Isabella said firmly. I'm coming with you. Edward hesitated but saw the determination in her eyes. Fine. Stay close and don't make a sound. They slipped into the cafe, keeping their heads down as they moved toward the back. The room Adrienne had entered was guarded by a heavy door, but as they approached, a waiter stepped out, leaving it slightly ajar. Through the crack, they could hear voices. Adrienne's sharp, clipped tone carried easily. He's late again. If he thinks he can stall us, he's mistaken. Another voice, gruff and impatient, responded, what about the woman? Isabella. If she doesn't leave soon, we'll make an example of her. Isabella's breath caught, and Edward placed a steadying hand on her arm. They exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to retreat before they were noticed. Back in the safety of Isabella's apartment, they unpacked what they had learned. Adrienne wasn't just enforcing debts. She was actively targeting Isabella, likely to pressure Lucas. The mention of making an example sent chills down her spine. They're escalating, Edward said grimly. We need to act before they do. What do we do? Isabella asked, her voice steady, despite the fear bubbling inside her. We find out who's pulling Adrienne's strings, Edward said. If we can cut off the head of the snake, the rest will crumble. Over the next few days, Edward used his contacts to dig deeper into the syndicate's operations. They uncovered a name, Claude Moreau, a shadowy figure who controlled the group from behind the scenes. Moreau was infamous for his ability to avoid detection, but one thing was clear, he didn't tolerate loose ends. Juliet's disappearance and Lucas's debts had likely caught his attention, and Isabella was caught in the crossfire. If we can link Adrian to Moreau, we might be able to expose them, Edward said. But it's risky. How risky? Isabella asked. Edward hesitated. We'd be walking into their territory. If we make one wrong move, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Isabella understood the stakes. But she also knew they couldn't stand by and wait for the Syndicate to strike. The next lead came from an unexpected source, Lucas. He called Isabella late one night, his voice panicked. They're closing in, he said. I overheard Adrian talking about a meeting tomorrow. Moreau's going to be there. Where? Isabella asked, her heart racing. An abandoned warehouse in the 13th arrondissement, Lucas replied. But you need to stay away. It's too dangerous. Why are you telling me this? She demanded. Because I'm trying to make things right, Lucas said. I don't want you to get hurt. His words rang hollow, but the information was too valuable to ignore. After ending the call, Isabella relayed the details to Edward. It's a trap, Edward said immediately. There's no way Lucas gave us that information without a reason. Maybe, Isabella replied. But if Moreau is going to be there, it might be our only chance to figure out what's really going on. Edward frowned, clearly torn. Finally, he said, if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. No risks. Isabella nodded, trusting him completely. Agreed. The next night, they arrived at the warehouse, its shadowy exterior looming like a specter. Edward had brought a small camera to document what they could and insisted they stay out of sight. Inside, voices echoed off the walls, their words indistinct but tense. Isabella and Edward crept closer, hiding behind a stack of crates. Through the gaps, they saw Adrian standing with several men, one of whom had an air of authority that could only belong to Moreau. We need results, Moreau said, his tone icy. I don't care who gets hurt in the process. End this. Adrian nodded, her expression grim. Understood. Edward captured everything, his hand steady, despite the tension crackling in the air. But as they moved to retreat, a loud clatter startled them both. Isabella's heart dropped as a flashlight beam swept across the room, landing squarely on them. There, someone shouted. Get them. The shout sent adrenaline surging through Isabella's veins. Edward grabbed her hand, pulling her behind a stack of crates as heavy footsteps pounded toward them. The dimly lit warehouse seemed to close in around them, every shadow a potential threat. This way, Edward hissed, leading her toward an exit on the far side of the building. But the path wasn't clear. A man stepped into their way, his flashlight casting a harsh glare. Stop right there, he barked, reaching for a weapon at his side. Edward didn't hesitate. He shoved a nearby crate toward the man, sending it crashing into his legs. The man stumbled, giving them just enough time to slip past him. The exit was only a few steps away when another figure appeared, blocking their escape. Get back. Adrian's voice cut through the chaos. She stood in the doorway, her sharp gaze fixed on Isabella. I knew you'd show up. Let us go, Edward said, stepping protectively in front of Isabella. Adrian smirked, her posture relaxed, but her eyes cold. You're in no position to make demands. Behind her, several more men arrived, surrounding them. The tension in the room was suffocating as Isabella and Edward exchanged a look. They were outnumbered, and escape seemed impossible. You've caused quite a bit of trouble, Adrian said, stepping closer. Spying on us, following me. Did you really think we wouldn't notice? What do you want? Isabella asked, her voice steady, despite the fear curling in her stomach. Adrian's smirk faded, replaced by an expression of grim determination. Your leverage, she said simply. Your ex-fiancé has a debt to settle, and you're going to help us collect. Lucas? Isabella said, incredulous. I have nothing to do with him anymore. Adrian shrugged. Doesn't matter. He cares about you, and that makes you useful. Edward stepped forward, his voice cold. You're making a mistake. This won't end the way you think it will. Adrian raised an eyebrow. And you think you're going to stop us? Before Edward could reply, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Adrian's expression darkened, and she turned to her men. We're done here. Move. The men began to retreat, but Adrian lingered, her gaze locking on Isabella. This isn't over, she said, her voice low. Then she slipped into the shadows, disappearing as the sirens grew louder. Minutes later, the police stormed the warehouse, their presence dispersing the remaining thugs. Edward and Isabella were questioned briefly, but managed to avoid revealing too much. They left as soon as they could, their nerves frayed and their relief tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't the end. Back at her apartment, Isabella paced the living room, her thoughts racing. They're not going to stop, she said, her voice trembling. Adrian made that clear. Edward nodded, his expression grim. We've forced their hand, but that also means they're going to get more aggressive. What do we do? Isabella asked, turning to him. We can't keep running. Edward was silent for a moment, then said, we need to find a way to expose them. The footage I got tonight, it's enough to implicate Moreau and Adrian in some serious crimes. But we need more. More? Isabella said, exasperated. They already know we're onto them. How much more dangerous does this have to get? As dangerous as it needs to, Edward said firmly. If we don't finish this, they'll keep coming after you, and anyone connected to you. Isabella clenched her fists, frustration and fear warring within her. But she knew Edward was right. If they wanted to end this, they had to see it through. The next step was to use the footage Edward had captured. He sent it to a trusted contact in the media, a journalist known for exposing corruption and organized crime. The journalist, intrigued by the story, agreed to help investigate Moreau's network. Meanwhile, Isabella and Edward focused on securing their immediate safety. Edward moved into Isabella's apartment temporarily, and they avoided predictable routines to stay ahead of potential surveillance. It was exhausting, but it was their best chance of staying one step ahead. Days later, Edward's journalist contact uncovered a critical piece of information. Moreau's operation was being funded by a legitimate business, a high-end art gallery that served as a front for money laundering. The gallery's next major event was only days away, and it presented an opportunity to gather more evidence. It's risky, Edward admitted as they discussed the plan. But if we can get inside and find proof of their operations, it could be the final nail in Moreau's coffin. Isabella hesitated. The idea of walking into the lion's den terrified her, but she couldn't ignore the chance to end this once and for all. Let's do it, she said finally. But we have to be careful. The night of the event arrived, and Isabella and Edward entered the gallery dressed to blend in with the elite crowd. The room buzzed with conversation, the air thick with the scent of expensive wine and perfume. Isabella's heart pounded as they moved through the space, their eyes scanning for any sign of Moreau or Adrian. The gallery's back rooms held the key to their mission. Edward distracted a security guard while Isabella slipped into an office, her hands trembling as she searched for anything incriminating. She found it in the form of ledgers, detailed records of transactions linking the gallery to Moreau's illegal activities. As she snapped photos of the documents, a voice behind her made her freeze. What do we have here? She turned slowly, her stomach dropping as Adrian stepped into the room, her expression a mix of amusement and menace. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as Adrian stepped into the room, her piercing gaze fixed on the incriminating ledgers in Isabella's hands. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she refused to let fear consume her. Well, Adrian said with a chilling smirk, you've been quite the busy little investigator. But you've overstepped, Isabella. I'm not afraid of you, Isabella said, her voice steadier than she felt. She clutched the ledgers tightly, determined not to let them go. Adrian tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Brave words. But bravery won't save you now. Before Isabella could react, Adrian lunged, grabbing her wrist in a vice-like grip. The ledger slipped from Isabella's hands and scattered onto the desk. She struggled against Adrian's hold, her heart racing as she realized just how strong the woman was. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long," Adrian hissed. "Do you even know what you're meddling in?" "I know enough," Isabella shot back. "I know you and Moreau have been using this gallery to launder money. And I know you're responsible for Juliet's disappearance." Adrian's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Isabella saw a flicker of uncertainty. "Juliet," Adrian said, her voice tight. "She brought this on herself. Just like you. Then why are you so desperate to stop me?" Isabella countered. "If you're so sure of your power, why not let me walk out of here?" Adrian's grip tightened painfully. "Because you don't understand what you've set in motion. You've made yourself a target, Isabella. And you won't survive what's coming." At that moment, the door burst open, and Edward stormed in. "Get your hands off her," he barked, his voice filled with anger. Adrian's head snapped toward him, and she released Isabella with a shove. "Ah, the knight in shining armor," she said mockingly. "How predictable." Edward didn't waste time on words. He lunged at Adrian, his movements quick and precise. The two clashed, their struggle chaotic as Isabella scrambled to gather the ledgers. Adrian fought fiercely, but Edward's determination was unyielding. He managed to pin her against the wall, his expression fierce. "Stay down," Edward growled. "Or this ends badly for you." Adrian glared at him, her chest heaving, but she didn't resist further. Isabella grabbed Edward's arm, her voice urgent. "We need to go. Now." They slipped out of the gallery unnoticed, their hearts pounding as they fled into the night. Once they reached a safe distance, Edward turned to Isabella, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," she said, though her hands trembled as she clutched the ledgers. "We got what we needed. That's all that matters." Edward nodded, his expression softening. "You were incredible back there. But you scared the hell out of me." "I scared myself," Isabella admitted, a shaky laugh escaping her. "But it's almost over. We have enough to expose them now." The next day, they met with the journalist who had been helping them. The photos of the ledgers, combined with the footage Edward had captured at the warehouse, provided a damning case against Moreau and his operation. The journalist promised to release the story within 24 hours, ensuring it reached authorities and the public simultaneously. But Isabella knew the fight wasn't over yet. Moreau wouldn't go down without a fight, and Adrian had made it clear she wasn't finished with her. That evening, as Isabella and Edward prepared for the fallout, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but she answered anyway, her instincts on high alert. "Isabella," Adrian's voice came through, cold and venomous. "You've made your move. Now it's my turn. What do you want?" Isabella demanded, her pulse quickening. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're up against," Adrian said. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts. It'll be your last." The line went dead, leaving Isabella gripping the phone tightly. She turned to Edward, her voice trembling. "Adrian isn't backing down." Edward's jaw tightened. "Then we don't let her win." That night, as the first headlines about Moreau's operation began to surface, Isabella felt a flicker of hope. They had struck a blow against the Syndicate, and the truth was finally coming to light. But Adrian's warning echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that the fight wasn't over yet. She couldn't help but wonder, what would Adrian's next move be? And would she be ready for it? The next morning, the city was abuzz with the scandal surrounding Moreau's criminal empire. Headlines splashed across newspapers and websites, exposing the corruption, money laundering, and illegal activities tied to the art gallery. Isabella watched the coverage with a mix of relief and apprehension. They had delivered a decisive blow, but she knew this victory came with consequences. Edward stood beside her, his expression cautious. "This is it. The beginning of the end for them." "And for us?" Isabella asked quietly. Edward placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're ready for whatever comes next. But no amount of preparation could have prepared them for Adrienne's retaliation. That afternoon, Isabella received another call from a blocked number. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't Adrienne's, it was Lucas's. Isabella, you need to listen to me, he said, his voice frantic. Adrienne's coming for you. She's not going to let this go. Why are you telling me this? Isabella asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Because I made a deal, Lucas admitted. She said if I lured you out, she'd spare me. Isabella's blood ran cold. And you expect me to trust you? No, Lucas said, his tone desperate. But I'm trying to make up for what I've done. I'll meet you. I'll explain everything. Just, be careful. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Edward was furious when Isabella told him about the call. It's a trap, he said, pacing the room. Lucas can't be trusted. I know, Isabella replied. But if he's telling the truth, this might be our chance to end this. Edward shook his head. It's too dangerous. Adrienne won't hesitate to kill you. Which is why we need to be smart, Isabella said. We'll go, but on our terms. They arranged to meet Lucas in an abandoned train station on the outskirts of the city. Edward insisted on bringing backup, his investigator and a small group of trusted allies, who would remain hidden, ready to intervene if things went wrong. As they entered the station, Isabella's nerves were on edge. The air was thick with tension, every sound echoing ominously off the walls. Lucas was waiting near the platform, his posture anxious. You came, he said, relief flickering across his face. I didn't think you would. Get to the point, Isabella said, coldly. What do you know? Lucas hesitated, glancing around nervously. Adrienne, she's not just after you. She's after Moreau. The scandal has made him vulnerable, and she's using you as leverage to take him down. Why would she turn on her own boss? Edward asked, his tone skeptical. Because she wants power, Lucas said. Moreau's empire is crumbling, and Adrienne sees an opportunity to take over. She'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. And what about Juliet? Isabella demanded. What did she have to do with all of this? Lucas looked away, guilt shadowing his face. Juliet knew too much. She tried to run, but Adrienne found her first. She's gone, Isabella. I'm sorry. The weight of his words hit her like a blow, but she forced herself to stay focused. If Adrienne wants to take over, she won't stop until Moreau, and everyone connected to him, is out of the picture. Exactly, Lucas said. Which means you're still in danger. Before Isabella could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the station. Adrienne emerged from the shadows, flanked by several armed men. Well, isn't this touching? She said, her voice dripping with mockery. A little reunion. Edward stepped in front of Isabella, his posture protective. It's over, Adrienne. The world knows what you've done. You won't get away with this. Adrienne's smile was cold. Oh, but I already have. Moreau's empire is falling apart, and soon, I'll be the one in charge. But first, I need to tie up loose ends. She nodded to her men, and they raised their weapons. But before they could act, Edward's backup sprang into action, emerging from their hiding spots, with guns drawn. The station erupted into chaos. Shots rang out, and Isabella ducked behind a pillar as Edward and the others engaged Adrienne's men. The air was thick with tension as the fight raged on. Adrienne, undeterred, advanced toward Isabella, a knife glinting in her hand. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, she snarled. Isabella stood her ground, her heart pounding as Adrienne lunged. She dodged, grabbing a metal rod from the ground and swinging it with all her strength. The blow caught Adrienne off guard, sending her sprawling. Before Adrienne could recover, Edward tackled her, pinning her to the ground. It's over, he said, his voice icy. Police sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. Adrienne's men surrendered one by one, and as the authorities arrived, Adrienne was dragged away in handcuffs, her expression a mask of fury. In the days that followed, the syndicate unraveled completely. Moreau was arrested, his empire dismantled, and Adrienne's plans for power crushed. Isabella's name was cleared, and she finally felt a sense of peace returning to her life. As she stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset, Edward joined her, a warm smile on his face. "It's over," he said softly. Isabella nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. It's over. But deep down, she knew the scars of this ordeal would linger. Still, for the first time in a long time, she felt hope for a future free of shadows, with Edward by her side. And this time, she was ready to embrace it.